First, we will talk about GDP. The growth rate for fourth quarter of fiscal year 2012 is 0.1%.
Our GDP measures the spending and, generally speaking, is the best indicator of how well an economy is doing.
In the past, starting fiscal year 2008, quarter 3, the GDP growth rate started to decline tremendously. Quarter 3 had a growth rate of negative 3.7%, and quarter 4 of fiscal year 2008 had a growth rate of negative 8.9%, and this was one of the worst parts of the recession.
However, the economy has been experiencing economic growth for the last 14 fiscal quarters, but it seems the growth is declining. Percent change went as followed since the fourth quarter of the 2011 fiscal year: 4.1%, 2%, 1.3%, 3.1%, and then 0.1%.
Regarding the election, the economy has been doing okay. It seems to have declining growth rates in the past couple of quarters. So for a candidate to say the economy is great wouldn't be true, and for another candidate to say the economy is doing horrible wouldn't be true either.
Our next category will be unemployment. As of February 2013, the unemployment rate is 7.7%.
This number includes all people who are willing and able to work but are not employed.
Long-term unemployment, 27 weeks or longer, remain the same and accounts for 40.2% of the unemployed.
Since the peak of unemployment in October of 2010, which was 10%, the unemployment has slowly been declining. Since August of 2012 to February 2013, the unemployment rate has been the following respectively: 8.1%, 7.8%, 7.9%, 7.8%, 7.8%, 7.9%, and 7.7%.
Even though the unemployment is still above the natural rate of 5%, unemployment has gone down slowly, so we can conclude the economy is doing fairly decent because of the decline in unemployment.
Now we will talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. From the data explained earlier, we conclude since the Great Recession, the economy has been in a recessionary gap, but improving as the unemployment rate drops. Also, it is currently moving toward long-run equilibrium. We know the economy is in a recessionary gap because the unemployment rate is above the natural rate of 5%, which is the long-run equilibrium unemployment rate. Any unemployment rate under 5% would tell us we would be in an inflationary gap.
The main cause of the Great Recession was the bursting of the housing bubble. This is when people were receiving mortgages they couldn't afford, and banks were lending mortgages they shouldn't have been lending. Once the housing prices began to decline, people were selling their houses for less than their mortgage, and this caused wealth to go down tremendously, because people had to use their money to pay off their mortgage rather than use discretionary income. Because of this, aggregate demand went down, causing the U.S. economy to go into a recessionary gap. This caused price levels to decrease, our DGP to decrease, and unemployment increase. This moved current output lower than potential output. The next category will be fiscal policy and the effect that it has in the economy. Some fiscal policies enacted were extending the Bush tax cuts and the stimulus Obama enacted. The Bush tax cuts were extended because the government did not want to decrease consumption, which would decrease aggregate demand. Also, the stimulus increased government spending, which would increase aggregate demand. This was enacted to try and make the recessionary gap smaller.
Recently, there were automatic spending cuts enacted in order to decrease the deficit. This was called a sequester, and it totaled to be spending cuts of $85 billion. The Democrats' alternative was a new income tax on the wealthy in replacement of these spending cuts. It would have been a minimum of 30% on the millionaires. The Democrats didn't want to cut all the $85 billion because they believed some of the programs were necessary and couldn't afford the cuts. Also, they proposed cuts to defense and farm programs. The Republicans wanted to give authority to President Obama and have him determine how to implement the $85 billion cuts. John Boehner, Speaker of the House, said the American economy is going to create more tax revenue this year than any other year in our history. We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem, and it's time to get serious about it. This is how John Boehner feels and how his fellow Republicans also feel.
The fiscal policies enacted have somewhat helped because unemployment has gone down and GDP has gone up in the past couple of years. We haven't made a full recovery yet, but we are definitely improving. So it is safe to say the fiscal policies have had a positive effect, but have not brought us to long-run equilibrium yet. It is not logical to cut government spending if you are trying to increase aggregate demand, so Boehner and the Republicans are wrong to assume the cuts won't stunt economic growth, according to economic theory. Also, it is not logical to increase taxes because it will also decrease aggregate demand, which would not help us close the recessionary gap, according to economic theory.
An interesting fact is the cuts threaten to trim as much as 1.5 percentage points from the projected 2013 economic growth and keep unemployment rates above 7.5% this year, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. The White House and federal agencies have also warned of potentially serious consequences: a weakened military, crippled air travel, decreased education funding, and job losses, among others. In conclusion, when taxes are lowered and government spending increases, price levels and real GDP increase while unemployment decreases, and this is shown by the policies enacted by our government.
On to the next category, budget deficit. The current U.S. national debt is $16,715,714,4,781.56, but increases as we speak. In fact, it increases on an average rate of $3.86 billion per day. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the deficit will total $845 billion for the end of the year. That would be down from the $1.1 trillion in 2012 budget year and the lowest since 2008. Throughout the past couple of years, the debt has still been increasing very fast, but the deficit has gone down. Even with the improvement, the government would be required to borrow 24 cents of every dollar it spends this year. Higher Social Security taxes have contributed to a smaller deficit. The tax on nearly all Americans who draw a paycheck rose 2 percentage points this year. That increased revenue in February by $8 billion. The tax increase is projected to raise about $10 billion more a month in revenue for the rest of the budget year.
Regarding the fiscal cliff and fixing the deficit in general, John Boehner, Speaker of the House, has a plan which would extend Bush-era tax cuts on income of up to $1 million. He described it as a fallback option to prevent a sweeping tax hike while negotiations continued on a broader plan. Obama threatened to veto this plan because he believed it would bring minimal changes to the current deficit problem. In conclusion, fiscal policy action, including increased government spending and lower taxes, should be effective methods to close the recessionary gap. But the federal budget deficit will increase because the government will have less revenue and more expenses or spending.